Ukrainian drone strikes on a Russian missile base have triggered blasts the size of earthquakes as America has pledged to send Kyiv glide bombs to increase its long-range strike capability, but the US stops short of giving Ukraine permission to launch cruise missiles and ballistic missiles at targets on Russian soil. And Vladimir Putin has once again ramped up his threats of a nuclear World War III. My name is Jerome Starkey. I'm the defense editor at The Sun newspaper, and this is Frontline, your weekly roundup of the most important news from the war in Ukraine. Now, we start with that spectacular attack on the Russian missile silo and ammunition base at Toropets in Tver Oblast, about 300 miles outside Ukrainian territory. A number of Ukrainian drones caused dozens of explosions at this base, one of Russia's most modern and newest ammunition dumps, which officials had boasted could withstand nuclear attacks. Huge explosions triggered by those drone strikes, causing seismic shockwaves that were picked up by earthquake monitors. At least 17 explosions measuring between 2 and 2.7 on the Richter scale. So each of those blasts around the size of a small earthquake, but the sort of earthquake that an ordinary person, you or I, might be able to feel. Windows in the nearby town of Toropets are blown out for miles around because this ammunition depot housed, we understand, around 30,000 tons of ammunition, including dumb artillery shells, but also longer range weapons, Grad missiles, many of the sorts, indeed Iskander ballistic missiles, all of which have been used to devastating effect against Ukraine. Ukraine hitting back, demonstrating that it has the will, the capability to launch, to continue these long range strikes. It's not the longest strike that Kyiv has launched by any stretch, but nonetheless significant distance from its territory, almost 300 miles, and a devastating impact. The footage, quite extraordinary, mushroom clouds billowing into the sky as a result of that strike. Now, this was about 8 days ago today as we're filming. Crucial nonetheless, though, because Ukraine has been asking the West for permission day in, day out, week in, week out, for permission to use these missiles, the American ATACMS, the British Storm Shadow, the French Scalp missiles, to use those against targets inside Russia. And America, because it's ultimately been America's decision, has so far refused. So with this strike, Ukraine showing it can use its own sovereign capabilities to conduct these sorts of attacks. And today, as President Vladimir Zelensky is in America due to meet President Biden, the White House has announced that it is going to send $8 billion worth of military aid to Ukraine between now and the end of the year. Now, that is $5.6 billion worth of aid, which we already knew about, but it's $2.4 billion worth of aid, which is new. And the White House said that that would include weapons to increase Ukraine's long-range strike capabilities, specifically America's glide bombs. Now, these are adapted air-launched weapons, relatively cheap, relatively simple air-launched weapons that can guide themselves onto target. The American version uses a combination of an inertial navigation system, that's basically sensors inside the weapon that can detect speed, direction, altitude, so it knows where it was launched and how far it's got. Also uses other systems, including GPS, but GPS likely to have been denied or compromised in the areas where these weapons might be used. Now, it's not clear if those weapons, if those glide bombs, those US glide bombs, will be allowed to be used against targets inside Russia. That is clearly what Ukraine wants. But nonetheless, the message from President Biden, from the White House, is that America is going to give Ukraine the resources it needs to win the war. Ukraine is clear that the resources it needs are weapons it can use against Russia. It's still unclear whether there will be a meeting of minds about that. And it's that debate, that ongoing debate, which has clearly influenced Vladimir Putin's saber-rattling nuclear comments. Once again, because it feels like we've had this conversation many times, Ukraine gets more weapons, Ukraine launches successful strike, Russia reacts with nuclear saber-rattling. At a televised meeting of the National Security Council in Moscow, Vladimir Putin went into some detail about the need to clarify Russia's nuclear doctrine. Now, Russia's nuclear doctrine allows for nuclear first strikes. That is not new. Broadly speaking, the grounds for which Russia previously could authorize a nuclear strike was if the Russian motherland was threatened. And when Russia annexed, at least in its own laws, constitutionally annexed those provinces, well, occupied Crimea, Zaporizhia, Kherson, Luhansk and Donetsk Oblasts, those provinces in eastern Ukraine which are partially occupied, there was concern that were Ukraine to continue to attack those areas, that might be considered a strike on the motherland, could allow Russia, under its doctrine, to use a nuclear weapon. That hasn't happened. Clearly, Russia doesn't believe its own lies. Those areas are not sovereign Russia. There was concern that strikes into what is genuinely sovereign Russian soil might trigger these nuclear strikes. Thus far, they haven't. Ukraine has not only launched a ground invasion into Kursk, it has for many, many months, as we've told you many, many times, been launching those strikes against the oil refineries, against the ammunition depot, like I just talked about, and against logistics hubs and train lines. And of course, the Kerch Bridge. It's launched those strikes against that bridge which links sovereign Russia's Kerch to Crimea. What Putin's been talking about is these clarifications, and specifically he said that Russia could launch strikes if it was attacked by a non-nuclear state, but that state was backed by a nuclear power. I mean, it's very clear what he's describing. He's describing the situation in Ukraine, a non-nuclear country which is defending itself from a Russian invasion and is defending itself with support from nuclear powers, most notably America, Britain and France. He also said that Russia could launch a nuclear weapon, strategic or tactical nuclear weapon, in the event that it detected a massive launch of conventional weapons, either from air or space. And he was quite specific that these weapons it would detect could include, for example, cruise missiles. And that goes back to that ongoing debate about the use of the British Storm Shadow, the French Scalp cruise missiles. These are bunker-busting cruise missiles which Ukraine desperately wants to use against high-value targets inside Russia. It's worth reminding you, we've talked about it before, but the message from many Western policymakers is that the West cannot afford to be deterred or scared by these nuclear threats. We heard it from Lord George Robertson, a former British Defence Secretary and NATO Secretary General, who said that these threats are hollow. He argued that Russia's threats to use a tactical nuclear weapon, these are the smaller nuclear weapons, less devastating, but nonetheless still awful weapons. He said those were hollow, they had no military use on the battlefield, radiation would blow back on Russia. More recently, in the beginning of September, we heard from the head of Britain's MI6 and America's CIA, who shared a stage for the first time, and both delivered this message that actually Vladimir Putin's red lines, his nuclear saber-rattling, these threats have continuously appeared hollow over the course of this war, and it's perhaps a reflection of the fear or concern that he feels that Western weapons could make a difference, could tip the balance and change the nature of the conflict, that he's trying to influence Western decision-making with these threats. And indeed, that is also the analysis of the Institute for the Study of War, which tracks the conflict in Ukraine very, very closely and produces daily updates about how the conflict is going. Concerned that Putin's latest comments deliberately designed to influence Western decision-making. The final thing for us to cover today is, of course, that President Zelensky is in the United States. He's met with Britain's Prime Minister Keir Starmer, who said, warm words, reiterated Britain's support. Keir Starmer saying he thinks the next weeks and months will be crucial for Ukraine. Part of that timeliness, that time pressure is, of course, we're running into the American election cycle. And actually, President Zelensky appears to have walked into a bit of a row in America. He made a visit to an arms factory in Pennsylvania, a crucial swing state. which has triggered claims from Republicans that Zelensky was partisan. He was effectively supporting the Democrats' election campaign for the forthcoming US election. Ukraine, Zelensky has sought to play down that with comments supporting or welcoming rather what he called the bipartisan support for Ukraine throughout this conflict. But of course, the truth is that there hasn't been bipartisan support throughout this conflict. The Democrats, President Biden has been in power throughout the course of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. He is the one who has led America's support for Kyiv. And President Donald Trump, former President Donald Trump, who's again hoping to win the election in November, has been far, far more reserved. He refused to say in an interview whether he wanted Ukraine to win. He's fallen back on statements suggesting he just wants a deal. He's claimed that he could end the war in a day, and that's raised huge fears inside Ukraine that were he to come into the White House, he would pressure Ukraine to capitulate for peace at any cost. Ukraine, at least publicly, maintains that it will not make peace while Russian soldiers remain on its territory, and it openly and ardently wants to join NATO, to have the NATO security guarantee to protect it from a repeat of this invasion in the future. As ever, if you've got any questions, please do ask them in the comments below, and I'll do my best to answer as many as we can next time, and if I can't, I'll get into the comments as well and try and answer some of them there. Apologies to some of you who are expecting an update a week ago. I realise it's been 2 weeks since our last update. That was unavoidable. A lot of you criticising me in the comments, I think fairly, for perhaps sloppy language where I talked about indiscriminate attacks by both sides. I was talking about an explosion, damage to an apartment building in Moscow, which appeared to be the result of a Ukrainian drone strike. That drone appeared to have been shot down by Moscow's air defences, and it collided with an apartment building. I'm not trying to draw any parity, any equivalence between the wanton indiscriminate violence that has been unleashed by Russia and Ukraine's counterattacks. But I think it is important for us to acknowledge that actually the nature of this conflict is that strikes cannot and do not always hit their targets. Both sides use area weapons. Those are weapons which are not precise, which can only be aimed at, for example, an area the size of a field rather than a target the size of a car. And indeed, precise weapons are shot down or go off course or fail. So it is impossible in all occasions for both sides to discriminate precisely at which targets they hit. And inevitably, in the horrors of a conflict as long and as furious and as violent as this, innocent civilians on both sides lose their lives or pay the ultimate price or suffer life-changing injuries. And that is the nature of this conflict. So I'm not drawing equivalence or parity, but I am making the point that both sides have killed civilians. Russia has killed far, far more, has inflicted far, far more death, destruction and violence, but we cannot ignore the nature of conflict. Question number 2, if the US refuses to give permission for these weapons like Storm Shadows to be used, why doesn't it give the technology so that Ukraine can develop its own sovereign weapons capabilities? It's a really good question, and certainly with some of the strikes that we've seen, not just in Toropets with those drones, but also of course with the maritime drones in the Black Sea hitting Russian warships, huge amounts of successful strikes undertaken, we understand, by sovereign built and designed Ukrainian weapons. It's quite possible there may well be covert, secret cooperation, collaboration, both in terms of the design and build and also in the deployment and planning of these operations. If that is happening, it hasn't been publicly avowed, and that would perhaps be for good reasons to avoid the sort of escalations we've already talked about. And finally, a similar question, which is what is the point of giving Ukraine weapons if it's not allowed to use them? Most of the fighting in Ukraine is on its own territory. Right? There's a 1,000-kilometer front line. Russia has advanced and continues to advance in the east, particularly in the Donbass around Pokrovsk. Ukraine is using Western weapons to slow halt and in some cases reverse those advances on its own territory. It does have permission to use the weapons it's been given. It's been using Storm Shadows and Scouts with devastating effects. They hit the headquarters of Russia's Black Sea Fleet in Sevastopol. They've used the American ATACMS missiles to hit high-value targets, high-value Russian targets, military targets in the Donbass. So they are using them, they just don't have permission to use them into Russia. Now, President Zelensky has promised to unveil what he claims is his plan to end the war. It is likely to include using those weapons, and it's likely to include his desire to use those weapons against targets in Russia. So this is something that's not going to go away, and we will keep coming back to it as and when there are significant developments. Thank you for watching this far. If you do have questions, as I said before, please ask them in the comments below, and we'll do our best to answer as many as we can next week.